Chapter 33 and 34, The Great Depression, the New Deal, and the Shadow of War. Introduction.
In this lecture, you will learn about the dramatic and traumatic decade of the 1930s, especially the Great Depression. A lot could be said, and has been said, about the Great Depression being history's necessary corrective for the country's fun-flinging escapade of carnival adolescent irresponsibility during the Roaring Twenties. There is something to that, of course, because the pendulum of history swings back and forth from one extreme to the other. But that doesn't mean that it was a mistake for Americans to enjoy their newfound prosperity in the 1920s, and it also doesn't mean that they should have suffered so long and so profoundly in the next decade as a kind of penance for having too much fun, as if the muse of history is a stern and humorless librarian who makes us stand in the corner and meditate on our sins every time we want to do something new and daring. Far from it. People have always come to this country precisely because it's a place that has the reputation of allowing every person the luxury of doing whatever new, fun, and daring thing they want to do, as long as it doesn't bother anybody else. In fact, Thomas Jefferson instructed us in the Declaration of Independence that we have an inalienable right to do new, fun, and daring things, by which he meant a right given to us by God, which means nobody can take it away. He called it a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So let's not be too hard on our country for pursuing those things a bit too irresponsibly from time to time. It's better to learn from our experience instead, so that we can write our own chapter in the American history book, which future generations will have reason to admire and even to emulate. We could say that this is the ultimate takeaway from our knowledge of those two tempestuous decades of the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression, of which you already have half the story in the previous lecture, and now you will get the other half. First, you will learn how incredibly, how hopelessly and irretrievably the country was stuck in the economic doldrums and malaise of the Great Depression. It really was a knockout blow to all levels of the economy, and nobody knew how to get the economic engine going again. We had had plenty of economic downturns in the past, some of them so severe that they caused widespread panic among millions of people. In fact, they were called panics when they happened. And the country had suffered longer downturns of the economy, too, real depressions. It hadn't mattered before if the economy were agrarian or industrial, if people lived in cities or in villages. Panics, and even depressions, were an accepted, perhaps even a necessary, part of capitalism, which was our form of economic growth, for better or for worse. And the prescription for recovery from a panic and a depression had always been to basically take 2 aspirin and go to bed as a country. You had to wait it out. But waiting out the panic which descended on the country in late 1929 was like waiting for the undertaker. It just would not self-correct like all the others had. And the longer you waited in helpless desperation, the more likely you were waiting for the undertaker rather than the angel of recovery. And let us keep in mind that when this calamity hit, Herbert Hoover was president. He had been one of the most successful wizards of economic recovery in American history up to that time. If even he could do nothing but watch the ship go down, well, you may be certain that all was lost indeed. That's what people were thinking, and the entire country was going down to an icy grave of historical anonymity. The Great Depression got deeper and deeper, while Herbert Hoover struggled frantically to keep the leaking ship of state from foundering. You will learn why this horrible prospect seemed like an inevitable reality in 1930. Why the country could not snap back to economic vitality this time. Now, we all know who became president next. Democrat Franklin Roosevelt replaced Republican Herbert Hoover. Since the voters couldn't think of anything else to do, notwithstanding Hoover's valiant but futile efforts to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on the gangrene decaying corpse of the American economy. But Roosevelt hadn't actually promised to do anything new, or anything at all, because he was just as much at a loss as Hoover was. So what, in fact, did he do? He got the top job. Every eye was looking at him, every heart aflutter with the fond expectation that he would pull some new rabbit out of a hat and wave a wand and save the country, when in fact he not only had no magic trick, he didn't even have a rabbit or a hat or a wand to wave over them. So what did he do? You will discover what he did. In fact, you will just get the highlights because he did so much, or rather tried so much, that a whole course in American history could be devoted to just that. Here you get the outlines. The point is that he tried as much as what he tried. And after you've heard this lecture, you will know why that emphasis was not just important, but necessary for the country to recover. Franklin Roosevelt, known thereafter simply as FDR, called the whole package of his recovery ideas his New Deal, by which he meant a New Deal for the little guy, the man in the street, the man with no job and a family to feed, that guy. FDR didn't just sit around and dream up projects and proscriptions to jumpstart the economy, though. He had a special technique for coming up with ideas and implementing them, and you will discover what that technique was. You will learn the 3 overall goals he set for his New Deal and how they were related to each other. It was all new in American politics, by the way. No president before FDR had ever dared propose what he was proposing, and nobody knew to what extent any of it would work, if it worked at all. Maybe he was paving with good intentions just another path to the country's inevitable demise. Nobody knew, including FDR. What he did know was that inaction was interpreted by the people as admitted failure and uncaring apathy, and that would be a path to destruction. So instead of making himself vulnerable to such accusations, his New Deal instead acquired its alphabet soup reputation, the creation of so many federal programs and bureaucracies that there was, people said, scarcely a letter in the alphabet that did not have the name of one of FDR's New Deal programs attached to it. People depended on the fact that at least the president was trying, probably because they didn't have anything else to depend on. And FDR did not disappoint. Inch by inch, the economy sputtered back from a coma of lingering, cadaverous morbidity to acquire a faint, but detectable, pulse of regeneration. The apple dealer sold his apples. The coffee shop sold a cup of coffee. The shoeshine guy shined a pair of shoes. The barber cut somebody's hair. That meant that somebody had some money to spend on apples, coffee, a shoeshine, and a haircut. Hell, if that's not recovery, what is? People were so desperate to see the glass half full of possibilities again, or if not that, just to see that there still was a glass to fill, that they seized on the symptoms of any economic activity as deliriously as the Druids of Stonehenge must have waited with breathless anticipation for the first day of spring, so that they could know with certainty that they had been granted the reprieve of another growing season. FDR was no economist, but he was a very clever politician. He had chosen as his theme song, in the depths of the Depression, a jig-time tune from the Roaring Twenties, Happy Days Are Here Again, and he had it played incessantly all through the Great Depression. We actually have nothing to fear, he said jauntily, but fear itself. So let's stop being afraid, and everything will be okay. I promise. Sure, it was pop psychology on the level of Dr. Phil, but it worked, little by little. You go with what works, said FDR, even if you don't know why it works. If it works. That confidence was FDR's magic trick, the rabbit he pulled out of his magic hat. And you will learn about the various ways he made it work for the mood of the country, which eventually translated into a modicum of economic survival, if not prosperity, for the man in the street. You will also learn about FDR's opponents, and he definitely had a few. Some were so influential that they forced him to change his New Deal to keep his edge and his reputation as the country's innovative leader. At times it must have seemed to FDR that every hand was against him, even that of Mother Nature. His New Deal was barely underway when the hapless farmers of the treeless prairie states were devastated by a climate and weather calamity that wiped out most of them and destroyed the country's breadbasket. The entire region was turned into a dust bowl, as it soon came to be called. This unfortunate event was not, however, just a freak of nature. In fact, it was predictable, which meant that it was also preventable, and you will discover why. With calamities roughly equal to economic victories after 4 years, when FDR had to run for a second term in 1936, his re-election was by no means a done deal. He won big anyway, and you will learn why the voters anointed him with a second chance to keep trying his economic nostrums. After that election, however, FDR might have presumed too much upon his mandate, because the next part of his New Deal, which he proposed early in 1937, got slapped down by the voters in the midterm elections of 1938, when they awarded new seats to both Republicans and conservative Democrats who opposed him. You will discover why the voters rebuked FDR in that pivotal election. After that public chastisement, FDR had to tread more lightly politically and be less daring and compromise more often. Yet the New Deal still needed all the daring of which it was capable if it was going to succeed at all. You will learn how FDR resolved this dilemma. His methods now became quite modern, for better or for worse, and you will begin to recognize in the changes he made some of the ways that modern presidents get things done. The fact was that after 2 terms with FDR, by 1939, the country was tired of not being able to get out of its wheelchair, so to speak, and the voters reflected that frustration by incrementally adding to the Republicans' growing minority in Congress at every election. Meanwhile, the rest of the world, mired in the same economic malaise we were, because this depression really was global, had succumbed, and was succumbing, to the siren songs of dictators who promised to put their people back on the path of prosperity and a renewed sense of national pride through, among other things, a commitment to rebuild their economies on a war footing. The proud Germans, humiliated in their first attempt at European hegemony by their defeat in World War I only a generation earlier, were now on the warpath again, under the charismatic and forceful leadership of Adolf Hitler, and they were rampaging through Europe, gobbling up weaker countries. That's where things stood at the end of Franklin Roosevelt's second, and presumably final, term. And at home, we didn't even have an army sufficient to protect our own borders, let alone export to Europe to save the Europeans from their own folly again, as Woodrow Wilson had done in World War I. We will shortly get to the story of how all that changed, but before we do, I'll give you a summary of the New Deal, and you will learn how well it met, or how much it missed, its intended goals. Then we will move onto the wider world stage to learn how the United States was coping with events on the volatile international scene during the 1930s, trying to remain a player while dealing with economic weakness at home at the same time. For though the U.S. economy was weak, President Roosevelt still wanted to stand up for American interests abroad when and where he could. He played the hand he had wherever U.S. interests were either threatened or needed improvement, which was pretty much everywhere in those troubled and uncertain times, trying to gain respect from rivals and would-be rivals, and to sow the seeds of peace and goodwill with friends and former allies. You will learn what his strategies were to accomplish this, and how effective they were, in both the Eastern and Western hemispheres. He had to sell his foreign policy initiatives to Congress and the American people, too, before implementing them, and you will learn how successful that project was. Regrettably, events still unfolded in both Europe and Asia as if the Americans were absent from the world stage, and that was not okay with Franklin Roosevelt. He came up with a plan, then, to end the Great Depression in one final burst of energetic determination while rebuilding American influence abroad at the same time. You will learn what that plan was. Just then, however, his second term was up. Traditionally, Americans would now choose a new leader. That, too, was not okay with Franklin Roosevelt. How was he able to persuade the voters to let him keep being president? How was he able to violate the 2-term tradition established by George Washington himself? Even the dynamic and fearless Teddy Roosevelt, FDR's inspiring mentor and distant relative, had not presumed to accept a third term when the country had practically begged him to do so. Even within his own party, few Democrats were enthusiastic about FDR being the first president to break the venerable two-term tradition, because it would always be interpreted as the hubris of a latent dictator, and thereby damaging to everything democratic institutions stood for. FDR did it anyway, and you will learn how and why he was able to pull it off. Then you will learn how he took his new perceived mandate from the people and ran with it, like a hungry halfback careening towards the goal line, knocking down and sweeping all before him in his new ambition to get the United States back onto the playing field of international competition at what he considered to be the most needful hour of American interposition into world affairs. You will learn how Adolf Hitler, himself consumed with his own mandate to grow German influence throughout Europe, actually played into Roosevelt's hands instead, when he made the one mistake that would help Roosevelt seal the fate of the Third Reich 4 years later. And finally, you will learn the one mistake the Japanese made, which would guarantee that Roosevelt could kick into high gear his plan to end the Great Depression in the United States and get the country back on the world stage at the same time. With that, the Great Depression of the 1930s finally retired, after 10 starving and desperate years of frustration for millions of Americans, into the history books. If the Roaring Twenties was a decade of comic opera on the stage of American history, the Great Depression was Götterdämmerung. Never had the country experienced so much, suffered so much, wanted so much, tried so much, and hopefully learned so much in so short a time as it did during those fateful 10 years of the 1930s.